On a fog-shrouded morning, a whisper rose from the low-country marshes, a whisper that history itself tried to erase. They say Charleston remembers everything except the truth. The mansions, the iron gates, the portraits, they all tell one story. But beneath them lies another, sealed and forgotten ledgers and unsigned agreements. You're not supposed to know what happened on that land. Yet here you are. The year was 1823, and a dynasty stood at the height of its power. Colonel Thaddeus, or a man celebrated for valor, feared for intellect, believed he'd found a way to control more than men. He wanted to control destiny itself. His experiment began as a private arrangement, buried under layers of polite society. But what he created was not progress, it was possession. Every great house in the South was built on paper deeds, contracts, and signatures. But this one bore no ink. Its words were written in silence, traded in candlelight, sealed with human cost. The colonel believed a single act could bind loyalty, wealth, and legacy forever. He called it a gift. The city would later call it a curse. When the first rumors spread, they came disguised as gossip. A missing family, a sealed wing of the estate, marriage celebrated with too much champagne and not enough joy. But those who worked the grounds whispered of something else. A paper so dangerous it was said to make honest men vanish. And then, one night, the ledger disappeared. The colonel's fortune did not. The family's name remained carved in stone. But the 7 marks beneath his seal, those names were erased line by line, as if history itself had flinched. You can still feel it when you walk near the old property line. The air turns heavier, like it remembers the secret you're about to uncover. What was this agreement? What price did he pay for power that could outlast conscience? Before we descend further into the buried heart of this dynasty's fall, take a breath and look around you. Every empire hides its own Ravencraft. Every institution begins with an agreement someone swore you'd never see. You ready to know what he gave away? Every secret begins with a justification. The colonel told himself that progress demanded sacrifice, that order required obedience. Those words sound noble in a speech, but in the quiet hours after midnight, they wrought into something else: permission. Charleston's elite adored him. They saw a soldier turned statesman, a man of reason, who could quote Latin while calculating profit margins. But behind his measured gaze was a private conviction that men could be redesigned, molded like clay, if one only mastered their fears. It wasn't hatred that drove him, it was curiosity, the most dangerous motive of all. He began drafting what he called the agreement, a document not of ownership, but of influence. Its clauses described methods of shaping perception, aligning loyalty, and ensuring permanent compliance through structured belief. To the untrained eye, it looked like business language. But between the lines lived a philosophy that would echo far beyond his plantation gates, a belief that people are most controllable when they believe they are free. The colonel tested this idea on every level of society. He donated to churches, sponsored schools, and invited politicians to his home. Each visit ended the same way: a private conversation, a promise of mutual benefit, and a subtle shift in allegiance. Within months, men who once opposed him began repeating his phrases in public, thinking they were their own thoughts. That was the genius of the agreement. It didn't need force. It only needed repetition. A lie spoken often enough with confidence becomes a creed. And soon Charleston itself was repeating the colonel's vocabulary: order, efficiency, prosperity. Words that glittered like light while hiding the mechanism beneath. But one man noticed the pattern. Reverend Samuel Hartwell, a quiet scholar with eyes that saw too much, began collecting fragments, letters, sermon notes, financial ledgers, each revealing a different face of the colonel's design. He realized the agreement wasn't about land or wealth. It was about mindshare. Control one generation's thoughts, and you own the next century's beliefs. By spring, spread through the taverns and dockyards that the colonel's power came not from soldiers or gold, but from a system, a way of turning faith itself into obedience. Some said he'd found the formula to enslave without chains. Others claimed he'd stolen it from older texts buried beneath the city's oldest church. The truth? He didn't invent it. He simply perfected what every empire had always known. And that's where our descent truly begins, into the architecture of control that still shapes the world you live in today. By the time spring turned to summer, the agreement had already escaped the colonel's study. It moved like a rumor through the drawing rooms of Charleston, elegant, polite, and poisonous. No one admitted to having read it, yet everyone seemed to quote it. Its influence grew because it never asked for belief, only cooperation. And cooperation is far easier to command than faith. The colonel understood this instinctively. People rarely question what benefits them, even when it corrupts them. His peers began to emulate his methods. They created societies, trusts, and benevolent associations, all echoing his language of order and progress. But beneath those polished words lived a new idea that morality could be manufactured if one controlled the story of what was right. Over the years, those private gatherings evolved into systems. They funded newspapers, sponsored public lectures, even shaped the curriculum in Charleston's elite schools. By the 1830s, children were reciting phrases from the colonel's writings without ever hearing his name. You can still find those words hidden in the archives of Southern Academy's lines about the natural order of prosperity, the harmony of service, and the duty of stability. It sounded harmless. It was anything but. Because the colonel's greatest insight wasn't in commanding people, it was in shaping the narrative that commanded them. He once wrote in a private note, later discovered by Reverend Hartwell, "To bind a man's body is simple. To bind his mind requires elegance. That elegance became policy. That policy became culture. And that culture, the idea that hierarchy equals harmony, seeped into everything. Politics, commerce, even faith." Reverend Hartwell tried to warn the city. He published sermons disguised as parables, stories about towers built on lies and kings who mistook control for creation. The people applauded his eloquence, but missed his message. They didn't see that he was describing them. By the time the colonel's descendants inherited his wealth, the agreement had outlived him. It had transformed from a private document into a worldview invisible, self-reinforcing, and nearly impossible to question. The plantation was long gone, but the structure remained not in fields, but in minds. Every generation that followed learned the same lesson, that power doesn't need whips or walls. It only needs belief systems dressed as virtue. And perhaps that's why you're here, because some part of you can feel it too. The quiet script running beneath everything you see. The same architecture that built empires is still writing headlines, still teaching obedience through comfort, still selling control disguised as freedom. This wasn't just history. This was the prototype. After the colonel's death, the legend should have ended with him. But ideas, unlike bodies, don't stay buried. They migrate, adapt, and disguise themselves as progress. His descendants learned quickly that power survives only when it changes its costume. So they left the plantations and moved into the new heart of America's ambition, industry, finance, and politics. The same formula that once ruled cotton fields now ruled ledgers and votes. Replace the overseer with an employer, the field with a factory. The sermon with a slogan, and the agreement still worked perfectly. By the 1850s, the family name no longer appeared on property deeds, yet its fingerprints covered banks, newspapers, and state offices. Their philosophy spread through law schools and pulpits. Order is prosperity. Questioning is chaos. Every speech, every newspaper editorial repeated the rhythm of those words until they became a reflex. It wasn't conspiracy. It was culture. Reverend Hartwell's surviving letters describe how the same phrases reappeared in legislation. Written decades after the colonel's death, identical turns of phrase buried. In the language of public good and moral guidance, the vocabulary of obedience had become patriotic. Factories used it to justify impossible hours. Preachers used it to silence reformers. Politicians used it to sell unity while securing control. The people called it progress because it came wrapped in familiar symbols, flags, hymns, and prosperity itself. And the agreement's deeper clause, the one that no ink ever revealed, said simply this: "Let men police their own minds. No army will ever be required." That single idea built the first psychological machine. It taught nations to worship productivity, to equate compliance with virtue, and to fear freedom if it arrived without supervision. Generation after generation inherited that reflex like a family heirloom. When the Civil War came, both sides quoted the same moral phrases the colonel had once written in secret. They fought for different flags but served the same logic, that hierarchy could redeem chaos. The colonel's true victory was not on any battlefield. It was in the words both armies used to describe themselves. By the time railroads stretched across the continent, the agreement had become invisible, woven into contracts, prayers, and oaths of office. A system so perfect it no longer needed a name. And somewhere, buried in a private archive, the original document waited, its seal cracked, but its idea untouched. When light first touched the city through electric wires, people thought they'd escaped the past. They called it modernity, the age of invention, industry, and freedom. But the new light only revealed how deep the old shadows ran. Electricity, printing presses, telegraphs, they all promised connection. Yet, to those who understood the agreement, every new device was another instrument of influence. A machine that could carry words faster than truth itself. By the 1890s, the colonel's descendants had traded plantations for boardrooms. They no longer owned land, they owned attention. Factories ran on steam. Societies ran on stories. Whoever wrote the message ruled the mind. A young executive from that lineage wrote in a private memo, "To sell a product, first sell the meaning of owning it." And just like that, the vocabulary of obedience found a new disguise: advertising. What began as the language of authority became the language of desire. No one needed to be forced anymore. They'd willingly pay for their own conditioning. Psychologists soon joined the orchestra. Their studies on suggestion and perception turned into manuals for persuasion. The same formulas that once defined social order now shaped consumer behavior, repetition, aspiration, fear of exclusion. The plantation had evolved into a marketplace. Reverend Hartwell's remaining journals mention a final warning that when control is mistaken for comfort, the soul stops recognizing captivity. But his words were drowned out by headlines promising convenience, progress, and identity through purchase. The public wasn't deceived. It was enchanted. By the dawn of the 20th century, the agreement's principles had gone global. A handful of voices could dictate taste, politics, even emotion, all without a single command. Because the new creed of the modern age was simple: if you can keep people busy consuming, they will never notice who is profiting from their attention. So the lights grew brighter, the slogans shorter, and the silence beneath them deeper. The colonel's experiment had succeeded. His philosophy had survived every moral revolution by becoming the language of progress itself. By the early 1900s, influence had a new name: public relations. Governments called it communication, industries called it branding, and citizens called it news. But the blueprint hadn't changed. It had only become polite. The first generation of image makers learned what the colonel had written a century earlier: controlled the story.
Art.
And you won't need to control the crowd. They studied psychology, rhetoric, and crowd behavior, not to understand people, but to predict them. If advertising could make a product desirable, then surely the same methods could make an idea inevitable. Newspapers began to blend fact with feeling. Photographs replaced debate. Slogans replaced reasoning. It wasn't deception, it was design. And for the first time, mass emotion became a measurable commodity. A senator from New York once remarked in a letter, "The public will believe what it repeats, and it will repeat what it feels." That single sentence became the unofficial mission statement of an entire century. During wartime, the same principles turned into patriotic posters. During peacetime, they became marketing campaigns. Either way, the machinery of influence grew faster than anyone could monitor. The colonel's descendants no longer needed to sign documents. They owned newspapers, studios, and agencies that shaped the very grammar of belief. Reverend Hartwell's surviving pupil, now an old academic, wrote a quiet essay that no one published. The agreement has learned to smile. He meant that coercion now came wrapped in reassurance, the voice that promised safety while deciding what you should fear. And as radio waves began to cross oceans, a new kind of power was born, one that could speak to millions at once. In the same tone, at the same hour, until emotion itself became infrastructure. By mid-century, the public had gained more information than any generation before it, and less independence of thought. The network was complete, an invisible lattice of persuasion, perfected by those who'd inherited the colonel's silent doctrine. They called it democracy. He would have called it efficiency. By the middle of the 20th century, truth no longer needed to hide in the shadows. It learned how to dance in front of the camera. Television turned the lessons of the agreement into an art form, a spectacle that smiled as it rewired perception. The colonel's descendants were no longer generals or plantation masters. They were producers, broadcasters, and sponsors. They didn't command soldiers, they commanded attention. And attention, they discovered, was the new currency of obedience. Every flickering image carried a message crafted with surgical precision. Color palettes weren't random. They were emotional cues. Laugh tracks trained audiences when to feel joy. News anchors modulated their tones to mimic authority. And beneath it all, pulsed the rhythm of engineered familiarity, the illusion that the screen was a friend. Television gave every household its own preacher. Not the kind who spoke of salvation, but one who defined reality through repetition. The flicker rate of the cathode tube lulled the brain into suggestibility, a modern trance state discovered accidentally by defense researchers in the 1950s. They realized people would believe almost anything if they were relaxed, entertained, and emotionally synchronized. It was here that the agreement reached its most refined form, voluntary submission. No whips, no chains, only stories. And the masses lined up willingly to be programmed, mistaking consent for freedom. Psychologists hired by corporate networks began testing language patterns that evoked compliance without resistance. They found that the human brain obeys emotion first and logic second, meaning the most dangerous. Sentence in any language became, "It just feels right." By the late 1960s, a few voices tried to expose this machinery: scholars, activists, even a handful of media insiders. But they were drowned out by louder channels, faster entertainment, brighter noise. The screens grew larger, the message grew smaller, and the audience, hypnotized, smiling, and numb, called it progress. Behind every broadcast, the same ancestral signature remained: the cold calculus that once justified human ownership now justified ideological engineering. The same system, the same design. Only the tools had evolved. You're not supposed to know this, because once you see the strings, you stop dancing. When the century turned and the signal went wireless, the chains disappeared, or so we thought. But the agreement didn't end. It evolved. The plantation became invisible, woven into the circuitry of everyday life. And the overseers? They were replaced by algorithms tireless, impartial, and utterly obedient to their makers. What was once a field of cotton became a field of data. Every click, every purchase, every thought you confessed online became a harvestable crop. The masters no longer needed to own bodies when they could own behavior. No need for shackles when men willingly carried their own surveillance devices in their pockets, smiling as they did. The colonel's bloodline had learned its final lesson. Control doesn't come from fear. It comes from convenience. They built systems so seductive, so beautifully useful, that no one wanted to escape them. GPS that tracks your every step. Feeds that know your desires before you do. Cameras that study your eyes to predict what keeps you still the longest. It isn't punishment anymore. It's personalization. Every like is a signature. Every share is a vow. And with every post, you renew the agreement, the ancient covenant between power and obedience. Rewritten in the language of technology. They no longer whisper orders in your ear. They whisper in your reflection the digital double they've built from your data, your habits, your history. That version of you is fed, measured, and modified until you believe what it believes, until you defend the system that feeds on you. The screen no longer tells stories. It tells you who you are. And the more you look into it, the more it takes your shape until you can no longer tell where you end and the algorithm begins. In the old world, they controlled the land. In the new world, they control attention. And attention is the seed of thought, the currency of faith, the throne of identity. Once they hold that, they don't need anything else. Men were once enslaved by force. Now they are enslaved by familiarity. The same voices, the same images, the same comforting noise, all designed to keep you docile, distracted, and proud of your cage. If you've felt the weight of this truth pressing against your mind as you watch this, I see the pattern twice in the comments. It's not for the algorithm, it's for your awakening. Because the first step in breaking the agreement is recognizing that it still exists. You've followed the trail this far. You've seen the kernel's signature echo through centuries, from chains to screens, from overseers to algorithms. Now, it's time to see what sits at the center of the maze. Not a man, not a family, a structure. Because real power doesn't announce itself. It dissolves into institutions, foundations, councils, think tanks, boards. It writes laws while pretending to follow them. It funds both sides of the argument, so the outcome is always the same. It never holds the title. It holds the mortgage. The descendants of the old dynasties learned this language long ago. Don't rule openly, rule through systems. Don't enslave bodies, enslave narratives. And so they built networks of banks, consultancies, lobbyists, regulators, and global NGOs, each one appearing separate, but bound together by a quiet consensus. Control flows not through a single throne, but through 1,000 invisible valves. These are not villains in capes. They're administrators of perception. Every major crisis becomes an opportunity to tighten the grid. Every panic justifies a new protocol. Every rescue creates a new dependency. And always, the language of progress masks the logic of control. In the kernel's day, the whip was visible. In the banker's day, the contract was visible. Today, the mechanisms are hidden in algorithms, treaties, derivatives, and metrics too complex for the average citizen to decode. The plantation has become planetary, and its most valuable crop is belief. Notice how dissent itself is managed. Approved critics, controlled outrage, endless debates that never touch the root of the system. People burn their energy fighting symptoms while the architecture beneath remains untouched, unspoken, unnamed. When you watch leaders speak, when you watch brands rise, when you watch movements go viral, ask yourself, who benefits? Who funds it? Who writes the scripts behind the slogans? The answer is not a single puppet master, but a culture of mastery, an inherited instinct born from centuries of owning labor, land, and now attention. This is the final echo of the agreement, not a signature on a parchment, but an agreement of silence among those who know how the game is played. They don't need to conspire in the open. They're raised in the same schools, speak the same codes, worship the same metrics. They don't need to meet. They already agree. You weren't supposed to see this far. Most men stop at the screen. Most men stop at the politics. But you're here staring into the machine itself. You've walked with me through the corridors of time from a single kernel sealed, bargained to the invisible contracts that bind whole nations. You've seen how chains became policies, how policies became platforms, how platforms became mirrors. Now, you stand at the edge of the rabbit hole. There's nothing left to reveal but the choice that only you can make. Here's the truth no one wants to say out loud. There is no savior coming. There is no rescue team. No election, no product, no movement will free you from a system you've agreed to serve with your attention and your silence. Freedom begins where obedience ends. And obedience today looks like distraction, like reflex, like scrolling without thinking. The colonel is long dead. His dynasty is buried. But the pattern survives because we feed it. Every time we trade our focus for convenience, every time we repeat a slogan we didn't examine, every time we let the screen define reality for us, breaking the agreement doesn't start with a riot. It starts with a refusal. Refuse the reflex to believe because it's repeated. Refuse the impulse to click because it's easy. Refuse to let algorithms know you better than you know yourself. Train your mind to pause, to question, to hold your attention like a weapon instead of bleeding it out like a wound. Remember, power no longer needs your body. It needs your story. Reclaim it, guard it, speak it. And when you meet others who've begun to wake up, teach them what you've seen here. Type "I break the agreement" twice in the comments if you're ready. Not for me, for you. It's a line in the sand, a public signal that the spell is wearing off. This channel, Fear Liturgy, exists to give you the language and the lens to see what you weren't supposed to see. But it's your eyes that must stay open, your mind that must stay sharp, your will that must stay sovereign. Share this video with a man you know is ready. Hit like if you want more of these forbidden histories. Subscribe so you don't lose the signal. Because this isn't just another story. It's a map. And once you see the map, you no longer wander. You navigate. You decide where the path ends.